Hello scoundrels, welcome back to the gang. If you're not a scoundrel and you would like to be, there is a sub button down below, and I heard it from a birdie. If you click the sub button, you save puppies. And obviously who doesn't want to save puppies, of course. So, you know, maybe you should be thinking about hitting that sub button, but only if you want to. First of all, I want to give a shout out to Captain Benzie, who very kindly answered some DM questions for me. I have played a lot of Eve Echoes, and I've played with a lot of different weapon types, but drones are the one weapon that I have not experimented enough with. And I had a few questions about drones, and Benzie answered them for me. So I'm also going to let you know that he's done a great video on drones, which I've just now had the chance to watch. Great video on drones. I'm going to link it in the description below. He's a really good content creator, and I would thoroughly recommend checking out his channel. He's growing at breakneck pace right now because he puts out some really, really good content. But for today, my comment from you guys, I would like to know which other content creators you're following as well. It would be really nice for you guys in the channel, the comments below, channel description. That's my job. The comments below to just let me know which content creators you guys are currently enjoying in Eve Echoes, so we can kind of watch them, and if anybody wants any extra suggestions, you can find them down in the comments. So that'll be my task for you today. Now, this video, we are going to be talking about the strengths and weaknesses of weapons and weapon types in Eve Echoes, which is why I asked Benzie about drones, because obviously I haven't had enough information or play with them yet. But before we get into that, I want to talk about the two main factors that affect how weapons target and deal damage, okay? There are two main driving factors behind the way that weapons target and deal damage in Eve and Eve Echoes as well. And those two particular factors are signature radius and flight velocity. All ships have a certain signature radius and a certain flight velocity. Right now you can see here on the Caracal, I've got a signature radius of 120 meters and a flight velocity of 219 meters a second. But let's say I went over and looked at a Condor 2, for instance, and I went to the details, I went over here. I have a signature radius of 35 meters, which is about a quarter of the Caracal, and I have a flight velocity of 400 meters per second, meaning that I am much quicker, I'm almost double the speed, and I'm also, I guess, 4 times smaller. And that's what I want you to get in your head. Signature radius is like a dartboard or a target, okay? The larger the signature radius, the larger the target. That's the easiest way of describing it. So if I'm throwing darts at a dartboard and I have a small frigate signature radius versus a large battlecruiser signature radius, I'm more likely to be able to hit the large battlecruiser on average than I am the small frigate. And obviously there are certain weapons that are better versus the smaller signature radiuses, etc. And obviously other things affect it, but signature radius also does play a part in how easy you are to lock. So that's why it's often harder to lock frigates, because they're harder to get a read on than the bigger battlecruisers. The flight velocity essentially relates to the tracking of your turrets, but also something called explosion velocity on missiles. So if you think about it like this, you've got your dartboard flying through the air, right? I have a turret that is, I don't know if this is even making sense the way I'm doing it. Let me find something better for a turret here, my child's toothbrush. I have a turret that's tracking, okay? If I'm going really quickly, as you would expect, it's harder for the turret to keep tracking with me all the time, right? It's harder to predict, harder for the turret to track. And so if I'm orbiting at a very quick pace, the turret's going to be constantly trying to keep up with the target, and that makes you harder to hit. And when you have explosion velocity with smaller targets, what happens is, this is now the missile. The missile comes in, and when it explodes, the explosion comes out from an epicenter, right? And it comes out at a certain speed. If it explodes next to my very quick target and I'm still moving, it will then only get hit by a certain portion of that explosion velocity, dealing just a fraction of the overall damage, because you've sort of, I guess, avoided the majority of the explosion. If I'm a large dartboard, my turret is going to have absolutely no problem tracking me when I'm going very slow. So if I'm a slow, large dartboard and I'm just moving slowly, the turret's going to have no issues tracking me. And if I hit with a missile, the entire missile is going to explode before I've even moved through the area that it's exploded onto. So those are the two ways that you think about the signature radius and the flight velocity, and I hope my ridiculous little analogy helped you understand how they impact how certain weapons work. So before we dive into the specific weapon types in EVE, let's talk a little bit about some weapon theory. And the weapon theory that I want you to grasp is the damage types, and when it comes to turrets, we're going to talk about optimal range and fall-off, and we're also going to be talking about tracking speed, okay? So, firstly, damage types in EVE. There are 4 main damage types: electromagnetic, thermal, kinetic, and explosive. Think of a spectrum, okay? Electromagnetic being one end, and explosive being the other. With electromagnetic, it's very good versus shield, but not very good versus armor, whereas explosive is not very good versus shield, but very good versus armor. Thermal and kinetic are essentially little halfway points between the two ends of the spectrum, with thermal being decent versus shield but not very good versus armor, and kinetic being decent versus armor but not very good versus shield. So we think of thermal and kinetic as the hybrid forms of damage, which will come in later when we start to talk a little bit about autocannons and about the hybrid weaponry, which is railguns. When it comes to turrets, there are a couple of things that you want to be aware of when it comes to turrets. And I'll go over the missile theory later, but because we're going to cover turrets first, I thought I'd do it in this section. There's a little graphic above which I pulled from the EVE University, which I think is pretty good. I'll link the turret article to EVE University in the description below. And essentially, it's talking a little bit about optimal range and accuracy fall-off. What you need to know is that every turret has an optimal range that it operates at. At that optimal range, it will have a 100% chance to hit. Depending on other factors, of course, as well. There are things like tracking speed and how fast the target is moving. But let's say the target is stationary or you know, just stood still. At the optimal range, there is a 100% chance to hit at that range. Then you have something called an accuracy fall-off range, which is 2.5 kilometers either side. For instance, of this small pulse laser, it's 2.5 kilometers either side. The optimal range, which is 5.25. Moving 2.5 kilometers outside of the optimal range is going to reduce your chance to hit by 50%. If you were then to move another 2.5 kilometers outside of the optimal range, your chance to hit will be reduced to 6.25%. So let's say you went from 5.25 kilometers to 7.75 kilometers, your chance to hit suddenly reduces by up to 50%. And it goes down from 100 to 50 over the course of that first 2.5 kilometers. If you go another 2.5 kilometers out of range, it will go from 50 to 6.25. So let's say that you go up to 10.25 kilometers, your chance to hit at 10.25 kilometers is going to be 6.25%. And then further than that, it drops down towards a 0.2% chance to hit. So that's what you need to know about optimal range, and essentially the kind of margin for error that you have when it comes to the accuracy fall-off. Then we have turret tracking speed, which is, as you can see here from the small pulse laser. In general, the higher the turret tracking speed, the better it is at tracking faster moving targets. And I'm going to give you an example here. Small pulse laser, a short range weapon with a tracking speed of 384, which is considered pretty good. It's pretty quick. You compare that to the beam laser equivalent, which has a slightly higher range. The tracking speed is much lower. And it means if a target is zipping around you in orbit and you have small beam lasers compared to small pulse lasers, your small beam lasers are going to have a much harder time tracking that target and actually applying damage, whereas your small pulse lasers will have a slightly easier time. And all turrets have different levels of tracking speed. The higher the tracking speed, the better it is versus faster moving targets. So that is kind of some theory that I wanted to talk about. Let's now start to talk about the individual weapon types and their strengths and weaknesses. So there is something that I want to talk about before I start talking about lasers, which is alpha damage. Alpha damage refers to how much damage a set of weapons will deal in a single volley, regardless of activation time and regardless of DPS. In the sense that if I were to fire all of my weapons at you in one go, how much damage would it deal? And alpha often refers to that because obviously with certain weapon sets, if you've got a high alpha damage, if you fire one set of your weapons and it blows a ship up, you know, having high alpha can be very good compared to DPS. And it's something that is worth talking about, although it probably doesn't make a huge amount of difference right now, but alpha is very good for fleet warfare because if you have a volley of high alpha weapons, you're looking to just blow a ship up in one go for the most part. But it's not going to make too much difference to you right now at this stage in EVE, but it is just something worth remembering and talking about in the future especially. So we're going to talk about lasers now. There are two main forms of lasers, pulse laser and beam laser. Pulse laser is shorter range but higher DPS, and beam laser is longer range but lower DPS. That is the general trade-off that you're going to find with pretty much all EVE weaponry. If you're in a close range format and you're going to deal more damage to compensate because you're likely taking more damage, if you're in a longer range situation, you're going to deal less damage because you're often safer as a ship. So those are the two trade-offs that you're always going to see. When it comes to lasers, let's talk about the pros and cons of lasers in general. They are all electromagnetic and thermal damage, so it makes them very good versus shields. There are good range options, you have good DPS, and in general lasers have got pretty good high alpha damage, especially the beam lasers. The alpha damage on beam lasers is actually pretty good. So those are some of the main positives for lasers, but lasers are not the most popular weapons in EVE, mainly because they do have specific drawbacks. They are only good versus shields, so that makes them, their sort of damage profile is kind of very narrow and is not as widely applicable across a lot of scenarios. They actually cost capacitor to fire. So for instance, you can see here with the pulse laser, the capacitor to fire a pulse laser is 3.3 gigajoules, which is a decent amount, and beam lasers take even more than that. The equivalent MK1 or Mark 1 small beam laser costs 6 gigajoules to fire. They have worse tracking speed than their railgun and cannon counterparts. So most people just don't actually end up using lasers in general. They're actually, I would say, and I would argue, unless you are specifically dealing with shield tanks and you're specifically looking to farm Garistas, for instance, lasers are probably one of the worst forms of damage types in the game. I've never been a fan of lasers because I do think they've got quite a narrow damage profile and they're not as widely applicable, but they are very good into certain ship types and they're very good into certain forms of defense, and because there is no electromagnetic resistance on shields whatsoever, lasers will tear through shields, so they're very good for that particular instance. But that's mainly what we're talking about with lasers. They are very good versus shields. They are, they've got good range. They've got good ranged options that the beam lasers actually have got pretty significant range, and they've got good alpha damage on the beam laser counterparts as well, but they don't have the same level of tracking speed as their railgun and their cannon counterparts. Their damage profile is quite narrow, which makes them less applicable across a wide range of situations, and they cost capacitor to fire, which is also going to be a drain on the ship that is firing them. So when we're talking about railguns, you have two different forms of railguns to consider, a little bit like the lasers. You have the rifled railgun and the snub-nose railgun. The rifled railgun is your longer range option, the snub-nose railgun is your shorter range option. These are Galente weapons, by the way. So look at the damage profile, it's mostly kinetic with a little bit of thermal, and that's going to lead me into some of the pros and cons of these weapons in general. Pros. They are some of the highest close range damage in the game. You can see the small snub-nose railgun, 13 DPS at Mark 1, and it's a very, very high DPS weapon. In fact, I think it is just the highest DPS turret in the game, but obviously they have drawbacks in terms of range. They have some of the best turret tracking speeds in the game. So you look at the tracking speed here, 550. What you need to be aware of is that compare that to the small pulse laser, which is the equivalent short-range weapon in lasers, it's got a much higher tracking speed, which means dealing with faster moving frigates, you're always going to have a lot of you're always going to do really well when you're running a snub-nose railgun because they have very high tracking speeds to deal with high velocity targets. And when it comes to the damage type, they have a balanced damage type. Now this is both positive and negative in the sense that railguns are kind of a jack-of-all-trades weapon. That's probably why a lot of people like to run railguns in general, because they are good in a variety of situations, but they never shine in, situations. They're good because they have thermal and kinetic damage, which is good versus both shields and armor, but they don't have any electromagnetic and they don't have any explosive, meaning that you're never going to have a railgun shining and absolutely destroying, but they have the versatility, which is important. Railguns are very versatile weapons in terms of their damage profile because they are good at dealing with both shield and armor tanks, but they're not excellent at dealing with shield and armor tanks like you would see with something like lasers, for instance. So they've got a very balanced damage profile in that sense. Some of the drawbacks, they are shorter range than their laser and autocannon counterparts. As you can see, a 1.5 kilometer range of a small snub-nose railgun is much shorter than the sort of the 2.5 that you saw coming out, or rather it was the 5 point something that you saw coming out from the pulse laser. So it's a much shorter range that you have to deal with when having a snub-nose railgun or even railguns in general. And their accuracy fall-off is a little bit shorter as well. So if you move outside of these range, the accuracy of the railguns is going to drop considerably. They also do cost capacitor to fire. They don't cost as much capacitor as the lasers, but they do draw from your capacitor every time you fire from your railgun. So just to be aware, obviously the pros we've talked about, the cons just covered there, but it's a very balanced weapon, and it's kind of, like I said, a jack of all trades weapon where it does a lot of things very well, but never really excels at anything apart from the ridiculous DPS that you get from snub-nosed railguns, which can be very strong in certain scenarios. So we're going to talk a little bit about autocannons and cannons in general. You have two forms of cannons in the Minmatar weaponry. You have autocannon and strike cannon. Autocannon is short range, strike cannon is long range. Some of the pros of autocannons and cannons in general, they have quite a balanced damage profile. They're better versus armor than railguns are, but they're slightly weaker versus shield. But they have a good balanced damage profile, which is again going to allow you to be versatile in a variety of situations, and also they're going to give you slightly better output versus armor in general. They have medium level tracking, so they're not as good as tracking as the railguns are, but they're better than at tracking than lasers are, which makes them pretty decent versus smaller and faster ships as well. And one of the other major advantages of autocannons and strike cannons is look at the optimal range. That optimal range is shorter than railguns, but I did mention that autocannons and strike cannons generally have longer range than railguns, and the reason that is that because the range fall off means that you can stray outside of that optimal range and still hit a higher percentage of damage than you would be able to when you're using railguns, for instance. So let's take the example of small autocannon versus small snub-nosed railgun. The small snub-nosed railgun, the optimal accuracy, or the optimal range is 1.5 kilometers with an accuracy fall off of 2 kilometers. So if I was to go to 3.5 kilometers, I would lose 50% of my damage application with the small snub-nosed railgun. But if I was to go to 3.5 kilometers on the small autocannon, I'd be hitting between 65 and 75% of my shots, retaining 15% of my DPS. This is both a blessing in disguise in the sense that when it comes to some of the drawbacks of autocannons, they generally have some of the lowest DPS outputs in the game. And the reason that is that because of the accuracy fall off, it's very hard to actually hit, especially because they have such short ranges as well, it's very hard to actually hit 100% of your damage all of the time. Especially because you cannot set an orbit, for instance, at 1.2 kilometers. You can only set at 1 or 2. So it's almost impossible to ever get 100% damage output from your cannons. One of the other pros is that they don't have capacitor draw. So they don't have capacitor draw, so they'll never draw on your capacitor when firing them. So there will never be another resource attached to them other than if ammo gets introduced. But when it comes to capacitor resource that you have to think about when using lasers and when using railguns, you won't have that to deal with when it comes to cannons. When it comes to strike cannons, they have some of the highest alpha damage in the game because they have a very long activation time. So a single volley from a strike cannon is going to deal more damage than almost any other weapon in the game, but they have a very long activation time. So if you miss, you're going to get punished more heavily. But again, very high alpha damage means that strike cannons, if they are targeted on someone in a fleet and then you see a volley of strike cannons at a particular target, you may be able to blow up that target in an instant if all of your damage hits. So those are some of the pros and cons of cannons. They're better versus armor than the railgun and the laser counterpart, but they still have a balanced damage profile, meaning that you can deal with shields with relative ease. They have a very high accuracy fall off, which means that if you stray outside of your optimal range, you're still going to land more damage than you would be with your laser and your railgun counterparts. But that is also a blessing in disguise in the sense that it's hard to keep 100% damage output with cannons because they're just not possible due to the fact that they have very short ranges and very high accuracy fall offs, or very high accuracy fall off ranges, which means that you're going to stray outside of that optimal range really easily, but the accuracy fall off means that you're going to be better when straying out of those optimal ranges, but you're never going to get 100% damage output from these weapons. And the other thing is they don't draw any capacitor use, so they're never going to be a drain on your capacitor when you're dealing with you sort of going into battle with these weapons. So there aren't many decomposers in the game right now, but I do want to talk a little bit about them. The small jet stream decomposer, which is out here right now, they are heavily weighted. They're essentially the equivalent of the armor version of lasers. They are all tailored towards dealing with armor. And you can see here the small jet stream decomposer, long activation time, a little bit like a strike cannon, but a very high DPS. So what I can tell from this jet stream decomposer is if you fire a volley with a DPS of 21.16 and a 7.5 activation time, you're going to hit really hard. Like the initial volley from a Jetstream Decomposer is going to be very, very big. I can't tell you too much about these weapons. I might do an individual video, but all we can see right now is they're very good versus armor. The tracking speed is pretty poor, which means they're going to deal with quick moving targets very badly. They have a very high activation cost. They draw massively from your even more so than lasers from your capacitor, but they have a huge alpha damage, and they're very good versus armor. So that's something to be aware of, that these are very, very good at shredding armor. They have a huge alpha damage, but they're not very good at tracking quick targets. They've got a huge capacitor draw, and they're not very good versus shields. So that's all I'm going to say about Decomposers for the time being. So there's a reason that I saved missiles to the end, because they're a different beast entirely when it comes to damage application. There's no tracking speed with missiles. They'll always chase down their target. But when it does come to deal damage, you have to consider two factors. Those two factors are explosion velocity and explosion radius, okay? The explosion velocity refers to how quickly the missile is going to explode from point of impact or point of detonation to its end radius of damage, right? So think about it like a kind of a sphere, in the sense that the epicenter will go out and all of the damage is dealt within that sphere, okay? A smaller explosion radius means that all of your damage is dealt in a tighter sphere, and a larger explosion radius means your damage is spread out across a larger sphere, and the explosion velocity is going to tell you how quickly. A small explosion velocity, or a low explosion velocity, means it's going to expand slowly like this, and a large expansion velocity or a higher explosion velocity means it's going to expand like this, and so you're going to deal your damage more quickly. What matters when it comes to explosion velocity and radius is that the higher the velocity and the smaller the radius, the better it is versus smaller ships and quicker ships. There is no penalty for smaller explosion radius and higher explosion velocity versus bigger ships, but in general, to have those kind of stats, those missiles will have a lower damage ceiling in general, which is why versus cruisers and battle cruisers, some of the bigger missiles are always going to be more effective, because they have a higher damage ceiling and they will not get penalized because those explosions are always going to deal, towards their maximum damage. Whereas if you fire a medium or a large missile at a frigate, it's going to avoid the majority of the damage because it will be able to escape because of the slow velocity as well as the very large explosion radius, which means it won't deal a huge amount of damage to them. So those are the two things that you need to be aware of when it comes to missile launchers. And that basically tells you everything that you need to know about missiles. Torpedoes are a different form of missiles. In general, torpedoes are a bit funny because if you look at the small torpedoes, what you'll find is that they have a very small explosion radius and a rather good explosion velocity, which means that small torpedo launchers are actually pretty decent at dealing with frigates. But then you go over to the medium torpedo launchers, and you'll find that they are almost useless at dealing with frigates. So, the small, they're supposed to be like a kind of more of a halfway point between just the really big explosion. For instance, like the straight up medium missile launchers, they have a very slow explosion velocity and a very large explosion radius, which makes them terrible versus frigates and terrible versus destroyers, but obviously good versus cruisers and battle cruisers, or rather battle cruisers especially, but they're okay versus cruisers. You compare that to the medium torpedo launcher, where the explosion velocity is very high, but the explosion radius is also quite high. They are better versus frigates, but not so good. Again, still pretty decent at dealing with the larger ships. Then you compare that to the rapid launchers. This is the ones that I use. They use light missiles, so the explosion velocity is the same as your small missile launchers, which makes them very good versus frigates and very good versus destroyers that are traveling at high velocity. So that's kind of velocity and radius explained. Let's talk a little bit about missile launchers in general. They have the most balanced damage profile. This wasn't the case in EVE Online. This is because we don't actually have ammo right now in EVE Echoes, and this makes missile launchers the absolute jack of all trades in dealing with encounters, PvE scenarios. It's why they're so highly sought after, because they have a very, very balanced damage profile. They also have very long range, and they have essentially 100% accuracy, because as long as you're within that range, the missile is always going to hit. One of the things about missiles that are different to turrets is that turrets do have that fall off either side of their optimal range. With missiles, as long as you're in range, you will hit. And that damage is going to be dependent on the size of the ship and how fast it's moving, and you compare that to your explosion velocity and radius, okay? They also have a pretty long activation time, which means that their alpha damage is pretty high. Missiles have got a fairly high alpha damage. Drawbacks of missiles is they have delayed damage application. You actually need to land the missiles to hit them, so when someone is warping out, the missiles are chasing them, sometimes they just won't get hit. And so it can be a bit tricky when dealing with someone who's trying to escape, that your missiles may actually never end up applying the damage because they're able to warp out of the scenario. So that's always been one of the major drawbacks of missiles. But the positives of missiles is that they are super long range. Like if you go to... you go to the civilian medium missile launcher, they've got a very long range, which can be accentuated quite nicely through rigs and skills. And they also, like you said, always are going to work if you're inside that range. There's never going to be any damage fall off. The only damage fall off that you're going to deal with is having the right missile launcher for the right type of target. So pros of missiles. Great damage profile, good versus pretty much any type of tank. They're a jack of all trades to the extreme, which means they're never going to be excellent versus specific types of tanks, but they're always going to be good versus every type of tank. They've got great range, they've got great alpha damage, and they always hit, so they've got 100% accuracy when inside the range that you're in. But some of the drawbacks, they have some of the worst damage application in the game because it's very easy to negotiate through missile damage application, and they are pretty inflexible in the sense that if you were to bring a medium missile launcher and there was loads of frigates, you'd be screwed. You'd need to have rapids or lights, which would require you to go back and change out your loadout. They have delayed damage application, which means they don't deal the damage instantly like some of the other weapons do. They actually need to wait for the missiles to land, which is always going to be one of the major drawbacks of missiles. But in general, they're a really good PvE weapon because of the fact that A, rats are never going to warp out, and B, you can maintain range in them really nicely, and they have a great damage profile, which means that any type of encounter that you go into, you're going to have missiles that are equipped to deal with the situation. So that's one of the positives and negatives when it comes to missiles. And finally, another type of weapon that is very different from our turret weapons is drones. And Benzi, Captain Benzi, if you don't know him, he's a content creator, big content creator in EVE. He very kindly answered some questions in DM to me this morning because I didn't know enough about drones. I don't use them as often as I would have liked. So I wanted him to answer them for me so I could kind of get to grips with drones and could be able to deliver the information to you. He's also made an excellent video on drones in the description below, which will go into much more detail than I do. So I'd recommend going and checking it out. And if you're watching this, Benzi, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I do appreciate you giving me the answers that you gave me because they've been very good. The first thing to know about drones is they're very versatile. Each different drone type will deal a different type of damage. So for instance, the Acolyte, it will deal electromagnetic, the Hornet will deal kinetic, the Hobgoblin thermal, and the Warrior explosive, as you might be able to see. And that means that you can bring a setup that is versatile. You can change drones out in combat, you can bring drones that are right for the situation, and they are probably some of the most adaptable weapons in the game. And you can also take medium, large, and small drones, depending on what type of ships that you're going to be facing. Obviously, small drones being better versus the smaller and faster ships, and medium drones being better versus the medium-sized ships, etc., etc. Once you get to that stage, you're going to have the ability to be very versatile in terms of, oh, I need some light drones here, or small drones here because I've got lots of frigates. Oh, we're going up against some cruisers and battle cruisers. I better whack out the medium drones. And all of that can be brought to combat without having to go back to a station to change your loadout, which makes drones very versatile. And when they're actually dealing damage, they have some of the highest DPS as well. They're very good at dealing consistent DPS. And so they're very, very decent when you actually get them deployed. One of the downsides, and a few of the downsides of drones, is that the damage to time ratio can be a bit iffy because you actually have to deploy the drones and then they have to travel to their target. And although they do travel quickly, they have to travel there, so you're losing DPS by having your drones travel out to that target, and then switching targets, they're going to have to travel and get into optimal range, and so on and so forth. They can be destroyed, which means the heavy ISK investments that you have for things like medium drones can go to waste, and they can be quite an expensive set. They can be quite an expensive type of weapon to run if people are going to target and destroy your drones. They are not particularly good in large-scale PvP warfare because it's very easy for a fleet to target drones and take them out and make them irrelevant and useless, meaning they're not often used in larger-scale PvP combat, but they are very good at PvE and smaller-scale PvP combat, which makes drones very good in those particular scenarios. They also require a more skill point investments than many other types of weapons, and if I show you It's because there are lots of different skills associated with drones, more so than the other types of weapons. And if I go to weapons technology, you'll see there is small drone, medium drone, expert drone, advanced drone, and then you have large drone upgrade, medium drone upgrade, etc. And then you have drone, advanced drone, and expert drone. So there is more skill point investment required to really get on top of using drones to the top level. So yeah, if you want to find out more about drones, definitely check out Benzie in the description below. But again, they're a very versatile weapon, but they do have some drawbacks compared to your more standard turret-mounted weapons. So let's talk about the best weapon, because I guess I titled this video, what is the best weapon? Well, I'm going to take the cop-out answer here. There isn't a best weapon, but there are weapons that are better in certain scenarios, and it really depends on what you're looking to achieve. But it really just comes down to personal choice at the end of the day. But I've gone through the pros and cons, and I'm hoping that can allow you to make a bit more of an informed decision about the types of weapons that you want to use in EVE Echoes. See you later, guys. Signing out. That was cringe.